a young mother vanishes into an endless cornfield, leaving her husband tormented by phantom text messages. When authorities finally locate her, the pristine scene completely defies forensic logic. Who was the mystery woman destroying their family, and what dark digital secret sealed her tragic fate? Please like and subscribe to join us on this case. This video contains chilling secrets. Viewer discretion is advised. When a human being develops a profound hatred for someone, the natural psychological response is avoidance. We naturally seek to distance ourselves from the source of our distress. However, this rule only applies to ordinary interactions between strangers or acquaintances. When that animosity is born from a twisted transition of deep affection into bitter resentment, the psychological landscape becomes incredibly complex and volatile. In these dark scenarios, reason is entirely overshadowed by a toxic cocktail of obsession, perceived betrayal, and an overwhelming desire for control. This catastrophic emotional deterioration often leads to reckless, hyper-violent choices and deeply tragic conclusions. This psychological descent is perfectly illustrated by a horrifying case that took place in Shuangliao City. Located in the western part of Jilin Province in northeastern China, Shuangliao is an area characterized by its vast agricultural expanses. In the autumn, the region is dominated by endless fields of tall crops, creating a rural landscape that feels both isolated and sprawling. For American viewers, imagine the expansive, lonely farmlands of the American Midwest, beautiful yet unnervingly desolate. On the morning of September 9th, 2016, the Emergency Dispatch Center of the Shuangliao City Police Department received a frantic phone call. The caller, completely out of breath and gripped by panic, shouted into the receiver, asking if they had reached the police. The caller begged law enforcement to hurry to Yuezhen village, stating that they had just stumbled upon the lifeless body of a woman hidden in the crops. Recognizing the extreme urgency in the caller's voice, the police did not waste a single second. Multiple units were immediately dispatched, racing miles down the rural dirt roads toward the reported location. Upon arriving at Yuezhen village, officers were directed to a vast cornfield on the outskirts of the residential area. They pushed their way through the dense, dry stalks, following the directions of the traumatized witness. Deep within a small clearing in the middle of the field, they found her. The victim was a young woman, positioned with her head pointing north and her feet pointing south. Even for the most seasoned detectives and the veteran forensic medical examiner on the scene, the sight was profoundly shocking. The brutality inflicted upon the victim was staggering. Preliminary evaluations estimated the woman was between 25 and 28 years old. She was fully clothed, but the trauma to her body was catastrophic. The killer had inflicted massive lacerations, not only on the outside of both her wrists, but also deep into the inner forearms. Furthermore, a massive, gaping wound had been sliced across her neck, cutting so deeply that the cervical vertebrae were plainly visible to the naked eye. Relying on their extensive experience with violent crime, the detectives immediately recognized this as a homicide of exceptional cruelty. However, as the crime scene investigators began processing the area, they noticed a forensic paradox that defied all logical sense. Despite the catastrophic arterial damage wounds that should have produced a massive volume of arterial spray and pooling, there was almost no blood at the scene. In a normal environment, severing the carotid artery and radial arteries would result in blood splattering for several feet in every direction, soaking the dry earth beneath the body. The strange absence of blood indicated that this location was merely a dump site. The actual murder had taken place somewhere else, or the killer had taken extreme, calculated measures to drain the body before moving it. This raised terrifying questions. What kind of intense grudge would drive a killer to commit such an elaborate, frenzied attack? What kind of monster possessed the physical strength and cold-blooded calculation to execute this? The nightmare deepened when the medical examiner transported the body back to the morgue for a comprehensive autopsy. Under the bright surgical lights, an even more disturbing reality came into focus. The medical examiner discovered that the victim had suffered horrific, targeted stab wounds to her lower extremities, inflicted by a sharp, pointed blade. The veteran detectives noted that in all their years of investigating violent crime, they had rarely witnessed such a frenzied, sadistic mutilation. The localized trauma to her lower body painted a clear psychological profile. This attack was fueled by intense, explosive rage and profound resentment, whether driven by a desire for twisted vengeance, extreme sexual frustration, or profound psychopathy. The killer had clearly exposed a severely depraved nature. The absolute first priority for the task force was identifying the victim. Fortunately, news of the grim discovery spread rapidly through the rural community. Within hours, a local family rushed to the police station, frantic over the disappearance of their daughter. Through interviews and physical verification, the police definitively identified the victim. Her name was Leng Shuang. She was 26 years old, a native of Shuangliao City, and a resident of the very village where her body was discovered. Leng Shuang was a married woman with her own family. According to her devastated relatives, shortly before the incident, Leng Shuang had casually mentioned that she was taking a short trip into the city center. After that conversation, she vanished without a trace. Her family had tried every possible method to contact her, calling her phone repeatedly, but all attempts were met with dead silence. It was not until the neighbor stumbled upon the horrific scene in the cornfield that her family finally learned of her dark fate. Given the extreme overkill and the deeply personal nature of the mutilations, forensic psychologists and lead detectives agreed that this was undeniably a crime of passion and revenge. Statistically, crimes of this nature are committed by someone intimately familiar with the victim. The investigative spotlight immediately turned toward Leng Shuang's inner circle, particularly her husband, a man named Zhou Renan. When detectives visited Leng Shuang's marital home to gather background information, they quickly uncovered glaring red flags. Interviews with multiple villagers painted a bleak picture of the couple's domestic life. Leng Shuang and Zhou Renan had a notoriously volatile relationship. The entire village was well aware of their constant, explosive screaming matches. Neighbors reported that the couple fought viciously at least every 3 days. Drawing on decades of criminal investigative experience, the detectives knew that escalating domestic violence frequently culminates in fatal outcomes. They firmly believed that digging deeper into this fractured marriage would yield the answers they were searching for. The task force formally summoned Zhou Renan to the police station under the pretense of assisting with the investigation. The moment he walked into the interrogation room, detectives noted his remarkably unusual demeanor. When informed of his wife's brutal murder, Zhou Renan exhibited absolutely no emotional response. There were no tears, no shock, and no grief. He appeared completely apathetic, staring blankly at the investigators. Detectives did not hold back. They aggressively confronted him with the rumors of his infidelity, the terrible state of his marriage, and the fact that both his mother and his in-laws were well aware of the toxic environment. They point-blank asked him if this boiling animosity had driven him to slaughter his wife. Facing the intense pressure of the interrogation, Zhou Renan remained eerily calm. He adamantly denied any involvement in Leng Shuang's death. He freely admitted to the detectives that their marriage was effectively dead and that all affection had completely evaporated, but he firmly stated he did not kill her. When investigators pressed him on his profound lack of grief, reminding him that they were legally husband and wife, Zhou Renan scoffed. He challenged the detectives, asking if his lack of outward emotion was a crime. He argued that no one could possibly know how he felt on the inside. The lead detective then demanded an airtight alibi, asking Zhou Renan to account for his exact whereabouts from the afternoon of September 8th to the afternoon of September 9th. Zhou claimed that he had worked until the evening, returned home, and spent the entire night in his bedroom handling personal business. Because he had requested time off the following morning, he claimed he simply slept in. When asked if anyone could corroborate this story, Joe Renan offered his mother as his sole witness, stating she had seen him in the house the entire time. The detectives quickly informed him that a suspect's mother does not qualify as a reliable alibi witness in a capital murder investigation. Lacking concrete physical evidence to arrest him, they were forced to release Joe Renan. However, they ordered him not to leave the city and immediately placed him under strict 24-hour surveillance. The investigators were absolutely convinced that the husband was hiding something. His evasive body language, his lack of an independent alibi, and his visible anxiety when discussing his marital problems all pointed to guilt. Just as the police were preparing to dig deeper into Joe Renan's finances and phone records, a casual conversation with a neighbor completely shifted the trajectory of the investigation. The neighbor, gossiping with a patrol officer, whispered that while the husband's family treated Leng Shuang terribly, she was not entirely innocent. Rumors were swirling that Leng Shuang had a secret lover hidden in the shadows. This revelation sent shockwaves through the precinct. The detectives realized they had developed tunnel vision, focusing entirely on the husband while ignoring the victim's secret life. They immediately pressed the neighbor for a name. Though she wasn't certain, she suggested the lover might be a man named Li Lingshen. Who was Li Lingshen? Background checks revealed that he was a former high school classmate of Leng Shuang. He also lived in Shuangliao City, but unlike Leng Shuang, he had what appeared to be a picture-perfect life. He was married to a beautiful woman, had 2 well-behaved children, and lived in a beautifully decorated home. It seemed entirely illogical that a man with such a stable, happy family would risk everything for a messy affair with a former classmate. Determined to uncover the truth, detectives arrived unannounced at Li Lingshen's residence. The home was exactly as described: warm, inviting, and filled with framed family portraits. It radiated domestic bliss. As the detective stood in the living room, feeling slightly out of place, Li Lingshen broke the silence. He looked directly at the officers and asked if they were there because of what happened to Leng Shuang. Surprised, the lead detective asked how he knew. Li Lingshen calmly explained that he had seen the news of her death on local broadcasts and anticipated their arrival because he had recently been in contact with her. He suspected his communications might have triggered a misunderstanding. Li Lingshen maintained a remarkably composed demeanor. He explained that he had recently met with Leng Shuang because she desperately needed a financial loan. Although he did not know exactly why she needed the money, he felt pity for her miserable marital situation. Demonstrating his transparency, Li Lingshen stated that he had explicitly discussed the loan with his own wife before handing Leng Shuang an amount equivalent to about $700 today. Their subsequent meetings were strictly for repayment purposes. Because she lived near his typical commuting route, he would simply drop by to collect the cash in person. To the disappointment of the detectives hoping for a suspect, Li Lingshen easily provided an ironclad alibi for the time of the murder, fully corroborated by multiple independent witnesses. However, he did not leave the police empty-handed. He offered a massive piece of investigative intelligence. Leng Shuang had recently confided in him, crying bitterly because she had caught her husband exchanging explicit text messages with another woman. Armed with this explosive new information, the Cybercrimes Division immediately confiscated and analyzed Joe Renan's mobile phone. Deep within his social media applications, investigators found a highly suspicious, unexplained relationship with an unknown woman on the WeChat platform. Scrolling through the chat history, detectives read a series of messages where this mystery woman aggressively claimed she was pregnant with Joe Renan's child and demanded he take full financial responsibility. The task force was thrilled, believing they had finally found the definitive motive for murder. They dragged Joe Renan back into the interrogation room, slamming the printed chat logs onto the metal table. Under this aggressive psychological pressure, Zhou Renan's arrogant facade finally shattered. Panicking, the husband swore on his life that he had absolutely no idea who the woman in the messages was. He claimed she had begun sending him these bizarre, accusatory texts completely out of nowhere, and he had ignored them. He frantically explained that the real reason he had acted so coldly during the first interrogation was sheer terror. He was petrified of the police, and terrified that if he said the wrong thing or showed weakness, they would railroad him for a crime he did not commit. He felt his best defense was total, silent apathy. Furthermore, Zhou Renan finally confessed the truth about his whereabouts on the day of the murder. He admitted that his previous alibi was a lie born of fear. On the day his wife was killed, he had actually traveled to Shuangshan town for a personal errand. He had lied because he traveled alone, had no witnesses to vouch for him, and believed that admitting he left the house would make him look incredibly guilty. Detectives immediately dispatched a team to Shuangshan town. By rigorously reviewing hours of security camera footage from various storefronts and interviewing shop owners he interacted with, they definitively confirmed Zhou Renan's true alibi. He was miles away from the cornfield when the murder occurred. He simply did not have the physical time or opportunity to commit the crime. The prime suspect was officially cleared. With the husband eliminated and the helpful classmate completely cleared, the Shuangliao City Police Department suddenly found themselves staring into a void. The investigation had hit a massive brick wall. Meanwhile, panic began to spread through the city like wildfire. Citizens were terrified that a sadistic butcher was roaming their streets, and public pressure on the police department reached a boiling point. Recognizing the extreme stakes, the police chief formed a specialized task force and funneled immense manpower and resources into solving the mystery. Fortunately for the detectives of the Shuangliao City Police Department, this horrific crime took place in an era defined by ubiquitous technology and digital footprints. The victim, Leng Shuang, was a young woman deeply ingrained in the modern digital landscape. In contemporary Chinese society, smartphone messaging applications, specifically the platform known as WeChat, function as the absolute center of daily life. These digital ecosystems handle everything from mundane social interactions and community group chats to vital financial transactions and mobile banking. The specialized cyber task force understood that if Leng Shuang was living a secret life in the shadows, the irrefutable evidence would be buried deep within her data history. Cybercrime investigators initiated a meticulous forensic extraction of her recovered mobile phone. They painstakingly reconstructed her deleted chat logs, analyzed her social media interactions, and traced every single mobile payment she had made in the months leading up to her gruesome murder. It did not take long for a highly suspicious digital profile to emerge from the endless streams of binary data. The account was registered under the name Gao Weiyi. As the detectives scrolled through their extensive, recovered message history, they watched a deeply chilling psychological narrative unfold in real time. The early conversations between the two were incredibly intimate, filled with romantic language, mutual complaints, and clear, undeniable evidence of a deep, illicit sexual affair. However, as the forensic investigators analyzed the messages sent in the critical weeks immediately preceding her slaughter, the tonal shift was impossible to ignore. Leng Shuang's replies had become exceptionally cold, brief, and highly evasive. She was clearly attempting to sever ties with the man, offering weak, repetitive excuses to avoid meeting him in person. The digital record painted a crystal-clear picture of a desperate young woman frantically attempting to escape the clutches of an increasingly overbearing and potentially dangerous lover. Hoping to catch the suspect completely off guard, the lead detective utilized Leng Shuang's recovered device to send a direct baiting message to Gao Weiyi, essentially posing as a ghost, reaching out from beyond the grave. The digital read receipt illuminated almost instantly on the screen, indicating that Gao Weiyi was actively monitoring the chat interface, his eyes glued to the screen. Yet, the interface remained completely devoid of a reply. The silence hanging in the interrogation room was deafening. The detective then boldly attempted a direct audio call through the application. The digital tone rang continuously out into the void before eventually timing out, met only by the hollow, empty sound of an unanswered connection. This deliberate, panicked evasion instantly elevated Gao Wei from a person of interest to the absolute top of the prime suspect list. Simultaneously, the Cyber Division made a massive, case-breaking discovery regarding the mysterious woman who had been relentlessly harassing Lang Shuang's husband, Zhou Renan, with claims of a secret pregnancy. By executing a digital subpoena and tracing the core registration data of that highly aggressive, hostile account, investigators uncovered the linked mobile phone number used to verify the profile. In a stunning, horrifying twist that sent shockwaves through the precinct, the registered number belonged directly to Gao Wei. The entire harassment campaign against the husband had been an elaborate phantom operation orchestrated by the secret lover. To confirm this theory, the task force quickly tracked down the real, living woman whose photographs had been heavily featured on the aggressive profile. During a brief, highly confusing interview, the bewildered, innocent woman confirmed she had absolutely no idea who Zhou Renan was and swore she had never spoken to him in her life. Her personal images had been maliciously stolen from public internet forums. Gao Wei had painstakingly crafted a completely fabricated identity, utilizing stolen pictures to terrorize Zhou Renan and systematically destroy Lang Shuang's marriage from the inside out. The disparate pieces of the investigative puzzle were violently snapping together, revealing a terrifying picture. Gao Wei was not just a spurned, heartbroken lover. He was a highly manipulative, deeply calculating individual who had actively and aggressively attempted to sabotage Lang Shuang's marriage from the shadows. Recognizing the extreme danger posed by a suspect exhibiting this level of psychological manipulation, the police chief immediately issued a citywide, high-priority arrest warrant for Gao Wei. A heavily armed tactical unit, clad in body armor and carrying assault rifles, descended upon his registered rural address, preparing for a violent, desperate confrontation. However, when they forcefully kicked open the wooden door, they found a dilapidated, crumbling structural ruin, completely devoid of human life. The rural home was practically a shell, freezing cold, utterly disorganized, and thickly coated in a layer of undisturbed dust. Interviews with the neighboring villagers revealed a deeply bleak portrait of the fugitive on the run. The locals explained that Gao Wei was a severely isolated, impoverished man who lived on the absolute fringes of their society. His mother, who had been his sole anchor in the world, had passed away somewhat recently after a grueling illness, leaving him entirely alone. He possessed no siblings, no close extended family members, and virtually no friends in the surrounding area. He was an absolute ghost within his own community, a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. Despite his vanishing act into the vast northeastern countryside, the intense public pressure, combined with the massive, inescapable dragnet deployed by the Shuangliao City Police Department, eventually proved highly effective. Exactly 48 hours after the gruesome, bloody discovery in the frozen cornfield, the Emergency Dispatch Center received a crucial, life-saving tip. A sharp-eyed, vigilant citizen reported spotting a nervous, erratic man, perfectly matching Gao Wei's physical description. The suspect was reportedly hiding out, nursing a drink in a small, crowded beverage shop in the neighboring commercial district of Yuanzhou. The caller bravely whispered into the phone that several local patrons had recognized the fugitive from the widely distributed wanted posters and were casually, silently blocking the main exits, effectively detaining the murderer until law enforcement could arrive. Within minutes, multiple patrol cars screeched to a halt outside the storefront. Heavily armed officers swarmed the small beverage shop, forcefully taking Gao Wei into custody without a single shot fired or any major incident. When the police department subsequently released his official mugshot to the terrified public, The citizens of Shuangliao City were deeply, profoundly shocked by the visual reality of the killer. The man single-handedly responsible for such a physically brutal, savage, and deeply intimate butchering was not a hulking, physically intimidating monster. Gao Wei was an incredibly scrawny, unremarkable, almost frail-looking individual with a gaunt face and sunken eyes. It seemed entirely incomprehensible to the general public that this pathetic, gaunt figure possessed the sheer physical ferocity, stamina, and cold-blooded capability required to commit the absolute slaughter witnessed in the desolate cornfield. The burning, inescapable question that consumed the task force, the relentless media cycle, and the local public was incredibly simple yet deeply complex. What profound, soul-destroying hatred could possibly drive such a pathetic, weak figure to execute such an elaborate, sadistic, and exhausting murder? The horrific answer, buried deep within Gao Weiyi's twisted, broken psychology, was a tragic tale of pathetic obsession, intense loneliness, and a violently manufactured sense of cosmic destiny. Sitting handcuffed to a heavy metal chair in the stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, surrounded by hardened homicide detectives, Gao Weiyi finally broke under the immense pressure. Shivering uncontrollably and looking completely defeated, he began to recount the dark, obsessive, downward spiral that ultimately led him to butcher the only woman he claimed to truly love. According to his chilling confession, the tragic saga began innocently enough on a crisp, cool afternoon in the late autumn of the year 2014. Gao Weiyi stated he was mindlessly scrolling through his mobile phone when a strange, unexpected message popped up in a massive community group chat dedicated to finding local, manual, part-time labor. These massive digital groups are incredibly common in the rural Chinese provinces, serving essentially as a digital bulletin board and social hub for housewives, unemployed laborers, and farmers looking for quick, odd jobs to supplement their meager incomes. The message that caught his eye was a frantic, embarrassing plea from a woman he had never met or spoken to. She was practically begging the hundreds of anonymous strangers in the chat group for immediate financial help, frantically claiming her cellular data plan was about to be completely suspended due to insufficient funds. She desperately promised to repay whoever could cover the minor bill as soon as she acquired the cash. To the vast, overwhelming majority of the cynical group members, the message read exactly like a blatant, low-effort digital scam. In the modern era, it is highly unusual, if not entirely foolish, for anyone to simply hand over hard-earned money to an anonymous, faceless beggar on the internet, based solely on a promise. However, Gao Weiyi, a profoundly lonely man suffering from an impoverished rural background, felt a sudden, inexplicable pang of deep empathy for the stranger. Having lived in poverty, he intimately understood the severe, crippling isolation of living deep in the countryside without a working telephone connection. Acting on a remarkably rare impulse of blind generosity, he silently and anonymously paid her outstanding mobile balance, transferring an amount of roughly 50 yuan, which is equivalent to about $7 today. At that exact moment in time, they were absolute, total strangers, and Gao Weiyi truly, honestly, never expected to see those $7 returned to his bank account. To his profound and utter surprise, the mysterious woman, who turned out to be the victim, Lang Shuang, actively tracked down his personal profile through the group chat administrators. She sent him a direct, highly emotional private message, profusely thanking him for his completely unexpected kindness, and she immediately transferred the $7 back into his digital wallet. But the interaction, which should have ended there, did not. A few days later, Gao Weiyi received another notification that would ultimately seal both of their fates. Lang Shuang, still deeply touched and emotionally moved by the simple fact that a total, unseen stranger had helped her out in a moment of extreme public embarrassment, adamantly insisted on buying him a proper meal to express her gratitude face to face. For Gao Wei, an older, socially awkward man who had lived his entire miserable life in perpetual bachelorhood and extreme social isolation, this simple dinner invitation felt like a miraculous, divine intervention. He had absolutely never been the object of a young woman's attention, let alone one who actively, persistently sought out his personal company. He eagerly, almost desperately accepted the casual offer, and several days later, the two officially met face to face for the very first time at a modest, dimly lit, inexpensive restaurant located on the dusty edge of the rural town. Despite the highly unusual and slightly awkward digital origins of their first meeting, the dinner proved to be an absolute revelation for Gao Wei. They conversed naturally, with the incredible ease and deep comfort of old friends reuniting after a long, painful separation. There was absolutely no hesitation in their dialogue, and no awkward, uncomfortable silence hanging over the table. Desperate to appear incredibly chivalrous, financially capable, and masculine, Gao Wei forcefully insisted on paying the final bill, completely and utterly charmed by Lang Shuang's bright presence. She walked away from the evening viewing him safely as a genuinely kind, highly reliable, older brother figure who had helped her in a bind. He, however, walked away from that table completely, dangerously, and irreversibly infatuated. As the weeks progressed into months, their casual communication rapidly evolved into a strict, daily ritual. At this specific point in his tragic life, Gao Wei was drowning in an impossibly deep ocean of untreated clinical depression. The relatively recent, painful death of his mother, who had been his sole anchor and only source of love in the entire world, had left him feeling utterly worthless, completely abandoned, and dangerously adrift in his own mind. Lang Shuang's sudden, vibrant entry into his bleak existence acted as a powerful psychological lifeline. Her warm, daily text messages and their occasional, secretive meetups forcefully pulled him out of his intense, paralyzing grief. He rapidly became, hopelessly, chemically addicted to the basic human attention and validation she provided him. Even when he inevitably discovered the crucial detail that Lang Shuang was a legally married woman with a young, dependent child at home, his intense, burning obsession did not waver or diminish in the slightest. Instead of making the rational, moral choice to walk away from a highly complicated and deeply inappropriate situation, Gao Wei's fractured mind convinced him that their random meeting in the chat group was a literal act of cosmic destiny. He twisted logic to rationalize that the universe had specifically sent her to rescue him from his miserable existence. Lang Shuang, perhaps deeply enjoying the immense validation of having an unconditionally supportive, utterly devoted listener at her beck and call, constantly reached out to him for minor daily favors or intense emotional support. She frequently, bitterly complained to him about the incredibly miserable reality of her domestic life, graphically detailing the intense emotional abuse she regularly suffered at the hands of her cruel mother-in-law, and expressing her deep disgust for the incredibly cold, entirely neglectful attitude of her husband, Zhou Renan. Every single complaint Lang Shuang uttered about her broken, loveless marriage served as highly combustible fuel for the dark, possessive, and violent fire growing rapidly inside Gao Wei's unstable mind. He began to view himself entirely as her destined, righteous savior. He developed a highly delusional, incredibly dangerous conviction that if he could just carefully orchestrate the final, explosive collapse of her failing marriage, she would inevitably, naturally fall directly into his waiting arms, and they could finally live happily ever after together. This incredibly twisted, deeply selfish logic birthed a truly malicious, calculating psychological plan to destroy her family. During one of their secret, intimate meetings, while Lang Shuang was momentarily distracted by an errand, Gao Wei stealthily snatched her unlocked mobile phone from the table Moving with frantic speed, he opened her messaging application and used the phone's internal camera to permanently scan the unique digital identification code belonging directly to her husband's private account. Armed with this direct, unfettered access to Zhou Renan's profile, Gao Weiyi initiated his covert psychological warfare. He meticulously and patiently constructed the incredibly detailed fake profile of a highly attractive, sexually seductive young woman. Operating entirely from the dark shadows of the internet, he began bombarding Zhou Renan's personal phone with a constant stream of explicit, highly suggestive messages, desperately attempting to bait the husband into a digital, traceable affair that could later be exposed to Lang Shuang. To Gao Weiyi's immense, boiling frustration, Zhou Renan completely and utterly ignored the tempting bait. The husband showed absolutely no interest whatsoever in the phantom woman's advances. Infuriated beyond measure by the husband's unexpected fidelity, Gao Weiyi drastically and aggressively escalated his digital tactics. He completely abandoned the slow seduction routine and directly sent Zhou Renan a highly realistic, forged photograph of a positive pregnancy test. He accompanied this shocking image with incredibly vicious, demanding messages for immediate child support, aggressively threatening to publicly expose their supposed secret affair to the entire village. While Zhou Renan remained mostly confused, highly annoyed, and entirely dismissive of what he correctly assumed was an aggressive internet scammer, Gao Weiyi knew exactly who would care deeply about the message. Playing the sinister role of the deeply concerned, highly loyal confidant, Gao Weiyi subtly and masterfully planted massive seeds of extreme paranoia directly into Lang Shuang's vulnerable mind. He gently suggested that her emotionally distant husband was highly likely cheating on her, and he actively, repeatedly encouraged her to secretly inspect Zhou Renan's private mobile messages to find the truth. Naturally suspicious, highly insecure, and already deeply, profoundly unhappy in her marriage, Lang Shuang took the psychological bait perfectly. Late one night, while her oblivious husband was fast asleep in their bedroom, she quietly crept into the dark, silent living room and meticulously scoured his mobile phone. When her eyes finally fell upon the explosive, damning messages from the phantom pregnant woman, she was utterly, completely devastated. Gao Weiyi's malicious trap had sprung flawlessly, setting into motion a chain of incredibly violent events that would ultimately end in her brutal slaughter. That evening, armed with the toxic seeds of doubt meticulously planted by Gao Weiyi, Lang Shuang returned to her marital home. In a display of profound psychological restraint, she prepared a warm, hearty dinner for her family, projecting an aura of domestic normalcy. She acted unusually cheerful and highly attentive toward her husband, Zhou Renan. Although he remained characteristically distant and emotionally cold, his wife's sudden shift in demeanor and uncharacteristic warmth made him feel slightly more relaxed and comfortable in his own home. He had absolutely no idea that this brief period of domestic peace was merely the calm before a devastating emotional storm. Late into the night, long after Zhou Renan had fallen into a deep, heavy slumber, Lang Shuang silently slipped out from beneath the blankets. Moving like a ghost through the quiet house, she stealthily took his mobile phone from the nightstand. Retreating to a secluded corner of the dark room, she opened his messaging applications, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. And there it was. Exactly as Gao Weiyi had so maliciously predicted, she found the highly explicit, demanding chat history between her husband and the mysterious, aggressive woman claiming to be carrying his unborn child. Staring at the glowing screen in the darkness, Lang Shuang was consumed by an overwhelming wave of fury and deep, agonizing betrayal. Instead of waking her husband and initiating an explosive confrontation right then and there, she chose a path of total, calculated silence. She carefully placed the phone back precisely where she had found it and retreated to her side of the bed, her mind racing with a million different thoughts. The next morning, The first person she contacted to share this devastating discovery was Gao Wei. For Gao Wei, this phone call was the ultimate validation of his incredibly twisted, manipulative grand design. Playing the role of the deeply concerned, thoroughly devoted confidant to absolute perfection, he rushed to her side to offer comfort and a strong, reliable shoulder to cry on. This highly calculated emotional support caused Ling Shuang's affection and deep reliance on him to skyrocket exponentially. From that fateful day forward, Gao Wei intensified his pursuit, showering her with unprecedented attention. He frequently took her out for expensive meals at local restaurants and constantly purchased small, thoughtful gifts for her, effectively buying her affections with money he barely had. Ultimately, this intense emotional manipulation culminated during one of their secret daytime excursions. Seeking absolute privacy away from the prying eyes of their rural community, they rented a discreet, inexpensive room at a local hotel. There, behind closed doors, the two engaged in a highly illicit, fully consensual physical relationship. After crossing that monumental physical boundary, their secret affair escalated dramatically. They became incredibly close, actively seeking out any possible excuse to meet in secret, managing to rendezvous at least twice a week. During this honeymoon phase of their forbidden romance, Gao Wei lived in a state of euphoric bliss. He thoroughly enjoyed every moment spent with Ling Shuang, absorbing her attention like a dying man drinking water. However, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks stretched into months, his initially innocent infatuation mutated into a deeply toxic, all-consuming obsession. He felt an intense, burning love for her that defied all rational logic, to the point where he simply could not imagine his life without her constant presence. He began to spend his days obsessively daydreaming about a picturesque future where the two of them were legally married, living together under one roof as husband and wife. The moment this incredibly selfish, greedy desire took root in his fractured mind, Gao Wei descended into a state of perpetual, agonizing anxiety. The intense, possessive lust festering in his heart grew completely wild, like untamed weeds choking the life out of a garden. He suffered from severe insomnia, tossing and turning in his empty bed, violently tormented by the reality that the woman he viewed as his soulmate was still legally bound to another man. Sharing her made him physically ill. Unable to contain his mounting desperation, Gao Wei finally confronted Ling Shuang, aggressively pressuring her to immediately finalize a divorce from her husband. To his profound shock and deep dismay, Ling Shuang reacted with extreme hesitation and a sudden, chilling indifference. She remained completely silent for a long, agonizing moment before finally offering a series of highly practical, deeply frustrating excuses. She softly explained that her child was far too young to endure the trauma of a broken home. She promised him that once the child was slightly older, she would actively seek an opportunity to legally separate from her husband. Furthermore, she suggested that Gao Wei needed to focus on saving a substantial amount of money first. She explicitly stated that only after he had established a solid, reliable financial foundation would she finally proceed with the divorce and move in with him. Ling Shuang spoke these words with extreme caution, attempting to placate her highly volatile lover without making any immediate, concrete commitments. Upon hearing these incredibly distant, future-oriented promises, Gao Wei chose to fully immerse himself in his dangerous delusions. He desperately clung to her words, convincing himself that he had finally secured a genuine, tangible hope for their shared future. He completely failed to recognize the obvious stalling tactics being employed by a woman who was rapidly losing interest. How could Gao Wei have possibly imagined that following this highly tense, uncomfortable conversation regarding marriage and finances, Ling Shuang's entire attitude toward him would undergo a massive, fundamental shift? From that day forward, whenever Gao Wei attempted to contact her or arrange a secret meeting, Ling Shuang suddenly produced an endless stream of highly convenient, highly suspicious excuses to avoid him. She stopped initiating any contact. She grew increasingly cold, utterly distant, and deeply apathetic toward the man she had once relied on so heavily. Initially, Gao Wei was profoundly confused and deeply hurt by this sudden, freezing isolation. He racked his brain, desperately trying to figure out what horrible mistake he had made to push her away. He was entirely oblivious to the harsh reality that his intense, suffocating demands for marriage had absolutely terrified her. In the deeply pragmatic, highly calculating mind of Lang Shuang, Gao Wei was merely a temporary, emotional crutch. He was a poor, aging bachelor from a severely impoverished rural background who could offer her a fleeting escape from her miserable reality. Currently, despite her deep unhappiness, she lived in a relatively large, comfortable home. Her husband, despite his emotional distance, possessed a steady, reliable income working as a mason, and they owned a valuable plot of agricultural land in the countryside. There was absolutely no conceivable scenario in which she would voluntarily surrender her financial security and social standing to run away with a penniless, obsessive loner like Gao Wei. Her tearful complaints about her miserable family life had merely been a way to vent her frustrations, not a genuine cry for a permanent rescue. By September of the year 2016, Gao Wei suffered a sudden, terrifying realization. He looked at his calendar and saw that an entire month had passed since he had last laid eyes on Lang Shuang. During this incredibly painful period of total isolation, she had exhausted nearly every single plausible excuse to avoid seeing him. Finally, when Gao Wei aggressively pushed for an in-person meeting, demanding an explanation for her sudden absence, she delivered a final, devastating blow. She bluntly told him that she had recently contracted a highly contagious gynecological disease, explicitly stating that if they continued to be physically intimate, she would undoubtedly transmit the painful infection to him. At that exact moment, the thick, heavy veil of delusion completely fell from Gao Wei's eyes. He finally understood the brutal, undeniable truth. He knew, with absolute certainty, that Lang Shuang was intentionally, aggressively ignoring him. The profound heartbreak and intense, suffocating panic that initially washed over him were completely paralyzing. He was forced to confront the humiliating reality that he had been entirely discarded by his lover, and that the beautiful, promised marriage he had so desperately dreamed of was nothing more than a cruel, empty fantasy. However, this profound sorrow quickly, violently mutated into an absolute, blinding rage. He could not fathom that the woman he had practically worshipped, the woman whose marriage he had actively sabotaged just to possess, could be so incredibly callous and deeply manipulative. In his twisted, highly toxic mind, Gao Wei became entirely convinced that Lang Shuang had maliciously used him. He believed she had only drawn close to him to extract emotional support and financial favors during a difficult period in her life. And now that he was no longer useful to her, she had unceremoniously kicked him to the curb like a piece of worthless garbage. Once this incredibly dark, highly toxic narrative took root in his brain, it became impossible for Gao Wei to accept the rejection. Slowly but surely, a deeply sinister, intensely violent desire for absolute revenge began to fester in the darkest corners of his soul. A terrifying, sociopathic mantra began to repeat continuously in his head, echoing the belief that if he could not possess her, then absolutely no one else in the entire world would ever have her either. Once such profoundly evil intentions are allowed to grow completely unchecked, they become utterly impossible to control, inevitably paving the way for the horrific tragedy that was about to unfold. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the psychological devastation that led to this breaking point, one must examine the profoundly isolated history of Gao Wei. He was born into a state of extreme, punishing poverty in the small, rural community of Muchen Village, located within the jurisdiction of Shuangliao City in Jilin Province. When he was merely 3 years old, his entire world was violently shattered when his father was suddenly and brutally killed in a horrific traffic accident. The incredibly heavy, suffocating burden of survival immediately fell entirely upon the frail shoulders of his grieving mother. She was forced to simultaneously play the role of both mother and father, breaking her back every single day just to keep them alive. To make matters exponentially worse, the family was completely drowning in a massive ocean of crippling financial debt. Prior to his sudden death, the father had incurred massive medical bills, forcing the family to borrow heavily from local lenders. Despite his mother's absolute, relentless dedication and years of back-breaking physical labor, she simply could never earn enough money to clear the insurmountable debt that shadowed their miserable lives. Growing up in this environment of constant struggle, Gao Wei-yi developed into an incredibly filial, deeply devoted son. When the school bell rang, signaling the end of his classes, he would immediately sprint back to their crumbling home. He spent his afternoons and evenings desperately helping his exhausted mother harvest vegetables, carrying heavy loads to the local market to sell for meager, insignificant profits. By the time he successfully completed his middle school education, the sheer physical toll of their poverty had become too much to bear. Completely unwilling to watch his beloved mother continue to suffer and physically deteriorate, Gao Wei-yi made the incredibly difficult decision to permanently abandon his formal education. He voluntarily dropped out of school to become the primary, full-time laborer for their deeply impoverished household. Although his mother was initially devastated and highly reluctant to allow her son to sacrifice his future, her rapidly failing health left her with absolutely no other viable options. She was forced to accept his sacrifice, while their combined daily efforts managed to keep starvation at bay, providing just enough basic food and simple clothing to survive. They were merely existing, not living. However, fate is often incredibly cruel, and their relentless struggle was far from over. Toward the bitter end of the year 2013, his mother's fragile health completely collapsed. She was struck by a severe, debilitating illness, and the necessary medical treatments instantly generated another massive, insurmountable wave of crushing debt. Deeply heartbroken watching her only son literally work himself to the bone just to afford her daily medications, his mother tearfully begged him to completely halt all medical treatments so she could simply return to their small home to die in peace. Gao Wei vehemently and aggressively refused her desperate pleas. To him, she was not just his mother, she was his absolute entire universe, his sole surviving family member, and the absolute only human being on the entire planet who genuinely loved him. Despite his heroic, frantic efforts and his complete willingness to sacrifice everything he had, they simply could not defeat the inevitable cruelty of disease. In March of the year 2014, his mother tragically passed away. This devastating, monumental loss left an incredibly dark, heavy psychological shadow over Gao Wei-yi's entire existence. He was completely gutted, thrown into a state of profound, absolute loneliness and extreme emotional isolation. It was not until he randomly crossed paths with Lang Shuang in that digital chat room that his bleak, colorless world finally regained a tiny spark of light. It was precisely because of this profound, crippling history of total isolation and desperate poverty that he developed such a severe, intensely toxic dependency on her. He harbored a desperate, clawing need to be loved, to be seen, and to receive the basic human care he had been denied his entire adult life. When she ultimately ripped that final lifeline away, she essentially signed her own death warrant. The stage was officially set for absolute terror. In the early, freezing pre-dawn hours of September 9th, 2016, Gao Wei-yi awoke with a chilling, deeply sinister sense of absolute purpose. He carefully and meticulously disguised his appearance, deliberately dressing in a set of heavy, dark clothing that he absolutely never wore in public. To further conceal his identity, he donned a mask, obscuring his gaunt, sunken features. Moving with the cold, calculated precision of a seasoned predator, he silently navigated the rural landscape until he reached a highly isolated, desolate stretch of dirt road situated near Leng Shuang's home. He possessed intimate, detailed knowledge of her daily schedule and knew with absolute certainty that she would be traveling down this exact path later that morning, as she had mentioned a planned trip into the main town for errands. During his later confession to the police, Gao Wei recounted this terrifying morning with absolute bone-chilling detachment. He calmly explained that he had deliberately and specifically chosen that exact rural road on the absolute outskirts of Shuangliao City because it was incredibly remote, surrounded by towering, dense crops, and completely devoid of heavy foot traffic. It was the perfect, inescapable trap, and all the deadly spider had to do was patiently wait for his prey to walk directly into the web. After agonizing in the freezing, biting chill of the early autumn morning for slightly more than 10 minutes, Gao Wei finally spotted the familiar figure of Leng Shuang walking down the desolate dirt path. The late-year air was bitterly cold, carrying a sharp wind that rustled the towering stalks of the surrounding cornfield, creating a profound sense of isolation. Leng Shuang, bundled against the morning chill, walked with a brisk, purposeful pace, entirely oblivious to the fact that extreme danger was lurking just a few feet away, hidden within the dense vegetation. Her mind was likely focused on her mundane errands in the city, completely unaware that a man she had casually discarded was currently gripped by a psychotic, homicidal desperation. Gao Wei remained perfectly still, his eyes darting frantically up and down the empty rural road to confirm that there were absolutely no witnesses in sight. Once he was entirely certain they were completely alone, he stepped out from the shadows of the cornstalks, physically blocking her path. His initial intention, according to his later confessions, was not immediate violence. He desperately wanted to force her into a rational conversation, hoping to somehow reason with the woman he believed was the singular love of his miserable life. However, this desperate plea for reconciliation immediately spiraled out of control. Instead of showing fear or offering a gentle letdown, Leng Shuang reacted with immediate, explosive irritation. Confronted by the man she had been actively dodging for weeks, she did not mince her words. She aggressively argued back, demanding an immediate and permanent end to whatever bizarre relationship he thought they had. She coldly, ruthlessly reminded him of the stark reality of their respective situations. She told him that they were absolutely impossible as a couple. She fiercely pointed out that she already had a family of her own, a husband, and a child, and there was no conceivable universe in which she would ever abandon them for a man in his pathetic financial state. Leng Shuang did not hold back her contempt, fatally miscalculating the extreme fragility of the man standing before her. She verbally attacked his profound poverty, highlighting his absolute lack of resources. She cruelly noted that while any normal woman would want a reliable car and financial security, he only possessed a beat-up, old motorcycle. She pointed out his utter inability to provide even a basic, decent house. She explicitly commanded him to stop harboring these ridiculous delusions, to stop pestering her, and to permanently disappear from her life. She stated that he was doing nothing but causing her immense annoyance. Hearing these incredibly harsh, freezing words from the very woman who had once eagerly accepted his financial help and welcomed his emotional support, felt like a physical knife twisting deep inside Gao Wei's chest. The agonizing pain of rejection rapidly morphed into profound, suffocating humiliation. He simply could not believe that the woman he had treated like absolute royalty, the woman he had catered to and obsessed over, could be so incredibly callous, materialistic, and emotionally bankrupt. In his state of overwhelming heartbreak, his desperation reached a terrifying, critical mass. Operating purely on a blinding surge of adrenaline and profound panic, Gao Wei suddenly lunged forward. He violently grabbed Leng Shuang by her arms, his frail frame suddenly fueled by the terrifying strength of absolute madness. Ignoring her screams and frantic struggles, he forcefully dragged her off the dirt road and deep into the dense, concealing stalks of the vast cornfield. The towering crops completely swallowed them, isolating them from the rest of the world. Suddenly pinned down and staring up at the wildly erratic, deeply enraged face of Gao Wei-He, Lang Shuang finally realized the catastrophic danger she was in. Panic completely consumed her. In a desperate, frantic bid to save her own life, she attempted to negotiate with the monster she had inadvertently created. She breathlessly told him that if all he wanted was a physical encounter, if he just wanted to have sex with her one last time, she would completely cooperate without fighting. She begged him, stating that she would submit to whatever demands he had, provided that afterward they would permanently part ways and never interfere in each other's lives again. This frantic, desperate offer of transactional sex was entirely outside the realm of what Gao Wei had anticipated. For a brief, agonizing moment, the intensely enraged man physically softened. A twisted, deeply pathetic glimmer of hope violently sparked within his fractured mind. He genuinely, delusionally believed that this sudden submissiveness meant their fractured relationship could still be salvaged. Loosening his violent grip slightly, he looked down at her with a pathetic, desperate longing and asked the fatal question. He asked her, with genuine expectation in his voice, exactly when she planned to finally finalize her divorce so they could move in together and live as a proper couple. Even in the face of imminent, terrifying violence, Lang Shuang's inherent pride and profound frustration momentarily overpowered her sense of self-preservation. Instead of lying to placate a highly unstable captor, her temper flared once again. She snapped back at him, completely shattering his final, fragile illusion. She angrily reiterated exactly what she had told him on the dirt road just minutes prior. She demanded to know how he could possibly be so incredibly selfish and completely delusional to demand she throw away her established family, her home, and her child's future, just to live a miserable, impoverished life with a man who could barely afford to feed himself, let alone provide a proper home. She spoke with intense impatience, entirely dismissing his pathetic fantasies as the ramblings of a loser. Those final, impatient words were the absolute catalyst for a complete, irreversible psychological collapse. As Gao Wei absorbed the full weight of her absolute rejection, his mind completely fractured. Every single beautiful illusion he had painstakingly constructed, every single dream of a happy future, violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a fraction of a second. He finally, truly understood that she had been playing a cruel, manipulative game with him from the very beginning. The profound sense of humiliation, combined with utter, blinding despair, mutated into a state of absolute, homicidal psychosis. The desperate lover died in that cornfield, instantly replaced by a cold-blooded, merciless annihilator. Without a single moment of hesitation or a single ounce of mercy, Gao Wei lunged forward and tightly wrapped his bony, calloused hands directly around Lang Shuang's throat. From a forensic psychology standpoint, manual strangulation is one of the most intimately violent, deeply personal methods of murder in existence. It is not quick, and it is not clean. It requires the killer to look directly into the terrified eyes of their victim, physically feeling the life drain from their body minute by minute. Gao Wei maintained his vice-like, suffocating grip on her windpipe for an agonizing 5 to 6 minutes. He felt her desperate, violent struggles slowly fade into weak twitches, but he absolutely refused to let go until her body went completely, permanently limp beneath him. However, the sheer act of taking her life was not enough to satisfy the explosive, volcanic rage festering inside his soul. His deep-seated hatred demanded a far more horrific punishment. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he retrieved a sharp, heavy-duty box cutter he had purposefully brought with him. In a state of total animalistic frenzy, he systematically inflicted severe, catastrophic damage upon her lifeless body. He violently slashed her wrists and deeply lacerated her throat, severing the arteries in a brutal display of extreme overkill. He then directed the blade toward her lower extremities, executing a series of deeply horrific, highly symbolic mutilations. This post-mortem butchery was a clear, psychological manifestation of his intense sexual frustration and his desperate, pathetic need to violently punish the woman who had rejected his advances. Because she was already deceased when these massive lacerations were inflicted, her heart was no longer pumping, which perfectly explained the baffling, terrifying absence of arterial blood spray that had initially completely confounded the veteran detectives at the crime scene. After completing his frantic, sadistic mutilation, Gao Wei scrambled out of the dense cornfield and fled the area like a terrified rat, leaving the butchered remains of the woman he claimed to love rotting in the dirt. But his incredibly pathetic, poorly conceived plan to evade justice was remarkably short-lived. In a state of perpetual panic and total paranoia, he was swiftly apprehended by the Shuangliao City Police Department a mere 48 hours after the horrific discovery of the body. On September 12, 2016, heavily guarded by a large contingent of armed police officers, Gao Weiyi was escorted directly back to the very cornfield where he had committed his unspeakable atrocities. Forced to conduct a meticulous physical walkthrough of the crime scene, he casually pointed out the exact locations of the struggle. It was during this chilling reconstruction that he provided one final, highly disturbing detail. He confessed to the investigators that before completely strangling the life out of her, he had indeed engaged in a physical, sexual assault against her in the dirt. He stated that the entire, horrifying ordeal, from the initial confrontation on the road to the final, bloody mutilation, had lasted for well over an entire hour. When the time finally came for him to face the ultimate consequences of his actions in a court of law, the pathetic reality of his character was fully exposed to the public. Standing before the stern, unforgiving gaze of the presiding judge, Gao Weiyi appeared as nothing more than a terrified, trembling coward. The adrenaline of his homicidal rage had long since evaporated, replaced entirely by a profound, suffocating terror. He babbled incoherently to the court, desperately claiming that he had suffered a sudden, uncontrollable psychotic break, stating that he had completely lost his mind in the days leading up to the murder. He wept openly, sobbing that he was entirely terrified to even remember the horrific acts he had committed in that cornfield. He spent his nights in the local detention center, violently jolted awake by horrific nightmares, deeply tormented by the freezing, brutal memory of her death. He cried to the judge, loudly lamenting his deep regret. He stated he was heartbroken over ruining his deceased mother's legacy, destroying the life of another child's mother, and brutally slaughtering a mother's beloved daughter. But his tears were completely hollow, offering absolutely no comfort to the shattered family he left behind. The monumental tragedy he had orchestrated was entirely irreversible, and his horrific, sadistic crimes were fundamentally unforgivable. The wheels of the justice system turned with deliberate, crushing finality. In June of the year 2017, the regional court formally convicted Gao Weiyi of intentional, premeditated homicide. Due to the extreme, exceptionally cruel nature of the mutilations and the highly calculated psychological manipulation that preceded the murder, the presiding judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty available under the law. Gao Weiyi was officially sentenced to death. The exact moment the judge firmly read the death warrant aloud in the silent courtroom, the convicted murderer completely collapsed. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his impending execution struck him like a physical blow. Uncontrollable tears violently streamed down his gaunt, sunken face, and his legs entirely gave out from underneath him, forcing the heavily armed bailiffs to physically drag his limp body out of the courtroom. His overwhelming fear and sudden, desperate remorse were tragically, pathetically too late. the monster of Shuangliao City would finally pay the ultimate, irreversible price for his profound greed, his intense selfishness, and his unimaginable cruelty. While Gao Weiyi was entirely capable of recognizing that his initial pursuit of a married woman was morally bankrupt, his extreme sociopathic desire to violently satisfy his own emotional needs blinded him to reality. He completely destroyed a family and orchestrated a slaughter that no one in their right mind could ever fully comprehend. Naturally, within the complex dynamics of this tragedy, the victim, Leng Shuang, made severe, fatal misjudgments. Her decision to entertain an illicit affair, to accept financial favors from an unstable stranger, and to repeatedly use him as a temporary emotional escape from her difficult marriage undoubtedly fueled the volatile situation. However, absolutely no amount of poor judgment or marital infidelity could ever possibly justify the horrific, barbaric slaughter she endured in that desolate cornfield. This incredibly dark, deeply disturbing case serves as a profound, terrifying psychological lesson. It is a bleak reminder of the absolute importance of establishing firm, clear boundaries in interpersonal relationships. It highlights the incredible danger of leading individuals on, especially those who exhibit severe emotional instability or profound isolation. We must always cherish our lives, treat our family members with genuine respect and open communication, and aggressively sever toxic, inappropriate connections before they have the opportunity to fester into something uncontrollable. The descent from casual affection to homicidal obsession is a dark, terrifying road, and as the tragedy in Shuangliao City violently proves, once that critical threshold is crossed, the resulting devastation is absolute. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly dark journey into the twisted psychology of obsession and betrayal. If you found this deep dive into criminal psychology completely immersive and highly engaging, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel and join our community for more intense true crime investigations. We would love to hear your thoughts on this complex tragedy down below. Do you believe that Leng Shuang's husband should bear any moral responsibility for the emotional neglect that sparked this fatal chain of events? Let us know your perspective in the comments section, and please remember to stay safe out there.